Now, speaking of U.S. wars, the U.S. government has reportedly killed alleged al-Qaeda recruiter Anwar Al Awlaki with a drone strike in Yemen. Now, Awlaki was near the top of the U.S. terror hit list, but here's the catch. He was a U.S. citizen. He was born in America. He was never charged with a crime and was assassinated without due process, which the Obama administration says is A-OK. And the U.S. mainstream media seems largely to be championing his killing as a victory for the U.S. The president hailed it, too, as a major blow to al-Qaeda's most active operational affiliate. Now, whether you agree or think that Awlaki was a bad guy or not, the question is, what does this mean for the U.S. Constitution and the rights supposed to be guaranteed by it to citizens? Well, earlier I was joined by Jeremy Scahill. He's national security correspondent for The Nation magazine. He's also author of this book, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. I asked him, regardless of what Awlaki was alleged with, what crime was he actually guilty of? Here's what he had to say.
I mean, that's what the White House and others are not saying. I mean, there's been no indication that Anwar Al-Awlaki was guilty of any documentable, indictable crime under U.S. law. If that was the case, why not indict him? So what the concern that I would have about the Anwar Al-Awlaki killing right off the bat is that we are setting a very dangerous precedent for killing our own citizens without anything resembling due process. Maybe the administration had evidence. If they did, then they should have brought forward a federal indictment against him. But the fact is that it didn't do that. And so that raises a whole slew of questions, particularly when you're talking about killing and targeting your own citizens when they're not on a declared battlefield. Anwar Al-Awlaki was not killed in a gun battle with U.S. troops in Afghanistan. He wasn't killed in a gun battle with U.S. Special Operations Forces in Iraq. He was killed driving in a convoy in rural Yemen in a targeted killing operation that Congress was aware of, that the White House was organizing, that was participated in by the U.S. military and the Central Intelligence Agency, and only a half a dozen members of Congress have ever raised a peep about the threats against a U.S. citizen. So to me, the key issue here is, what crime was this U.S. citizen accused of? And the answer is none. He was not accused in any court of law, only in the court of public opinion and by U.S. officials, mostly anonymous ones.
And since that is the case, and as you mentioned that the president can now essentially kill citizens without due process of law, what does this say about the United States? Isn't this the mark of an authoritarian state?
Well, I mean, I think when we start to talk about killing our own citizens, a country that cannibalizes its own is heading down a very dangerous path. But let's remember that we should also step back from harping on the fact that Anwar Al-Awlaki was a U.S. citizen, and remember that assassination has become the name of the U.S. foreign policy game. President Obama has dramatically expanded these kinds of targeted killing operations with the Joint Special Operations Command and the CIA in Pakistan, increasingly in Somalia, where I just was, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, elsewhere around the world. We're not just using drones, we're using Tomahawk cruise missiles. What I think is really dangerous here is that President Obama has solidified as a bipartisan policy the idea that the entire world is a battlefield and that the U.S. has the right to go into any country, allies or enemy, and kill whomever it wants with a very flimsy stretch of a legal justification for doing so in some cases.
So you're more concerned with the expansion of what it means to have a war on terror, that it's everywhere?
Well, I think that this was sort of, Donald Rumsfeld's wet dream was having a world where, the United States was able to pummel whomever it wanted, whenever it wanted, regardless of what international law says about it, regardless of what the home country says about it. And I think that if you had a President McCain in the White House instead of a President Obama, I think you would have had ludicrous, ridiculous policies that would have been, rife with opportunities for blowback. McCain may have been, much worse on a foreign policy level in terms of large-scale military deployments. But to me, the concern is that President Obama has made it acceptable for many liberals who otherwise would have been protesting it or objecting to it. So my concern is, going forward, we've now set a precedent where Democrats and Republicans both embrace the idea that the United States has a right to bomb any country that it wants, whenever it wants, or to assassinate people around the world, even its own citizens, with no indictment and nothing even vaguely resembling due process.
So you're saying that Obama has made Rumsfeld's wet dream come true?
I'm saying that President Obama has continued policies and intensified policies that would have been widely protested and objected to, including by congressional Democrats, if you had a Republican in power. This is exactly what President Clinton did with his domestic agenda in the 1990s, where he pushed through the precursor to the Patriot Act, the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act, where his policies on the omnibus crime bill were very much in line with the Republican agenda. And what you do then is that you move the country a little bit further to the right when you have Democrats embrace these policies and go off to the races with them. And that's my concern, is that this has taken our country in a far more dangerous direction than if it was just Republicans doing it.
It's interesting. And I do want to get back a little bit to Awlaki, because I think it's interesting that today the White House and the CIA are calling him the chief of external operations for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And they used to call him a militant cleric, and only more recently have they said he is increasingly in an operational role for AQAP. Has the White House exaggerated this man's role?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, neither you nor I have access to, the intelligence that President Obama is looking at. So, but what I do know is that the use of that term, the chief of external operations, I don't know anyone that's ever heard Awlaki referred to in that way. And it clearly was an attempt by the White House to give Awlaki more of a military significance so that they could justify him as a military target. But to directly answer your question, I think there's been tremendous exaggeration on the role and importance of Anwar Al Awlaki. He was at best mid-level management of AQAP. The greatest threat that he posed to the United States were his online videos encouraging young English-speaking Muslims to join a jihad against the United States, and that was despicable. What he was doing was despicable. Some could say it was hate speech or inciting violence, but we have a way of dealing with people that engage in those kinds of activities, particularly when they're U.S. citizens. You don't just go and assassinate them.
Unless you're the U.S. government, I guess. That was Jeremy Scahill, national security correspondent for The Nation magazine and author of Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army.